What's going on, everybody? We are back. Steelers OTAs underway. Still no Aaron Rodgers, but plenty of stuff to talk about. Today's video going to be reviewing the Steelers 2024 draft class. Just over the weekend, kind of went back and forth. We watched a couple games of each of these players, just kind of get a feel for how they finished the season, where they're at as players, what they're good at right now. Just some things that they'll need to improve on, and just the outlook on them kind of moving forward with this team. So this is an exercise that I always kind of like to do each year, setting some realistic expectations for these guys going forward. We may do the 2023 draft class next. If that's something that you guys are interested in, just let me know. Before we get started, please make sure to like the video, subscribe, drop me a comment. All that stuff is greatly appreciated. I'd like to hear from you guys. Which of these players are you most excited to see in 2025 take the field? So I know my answer to that, but I'm curious on where you guys lie with that question. But without further ado, I kind of want to talk about Fotanu. Really the forgotten man amongst the class, honestly. Unfortunately, we didn't really get to see him last season. He did fully participate in today's OTAs at right tackle, which was kind of nice to see, just see him out there moving, getting some reps in with the starters, things like that. But, his lone start against the Broncos last year, I thought that he got off to a little bit of a slow start, but did, acclimate himself really well throughout the game as it went along. And, he had a lot of reps against Jonathan Cooper, who is really a power rusher, was kind of testing his anchoring ability. And I thought he really held his own and really got involved in the run game in the second half. And, I thought he finished that one pretty strong, kind of a fluky type of injury, unfortunately, in practice that ended up cutting his season short. But, just kind of reviewing some of my notes on him coming out of college, I thought he was a really rare, dynamic athlete, really explosive out of his stance. He could toggle between different sets to keep rushers off balance. That's something I really like out of tackles. The burst off the ball, was really helpful in executing those reach blocks. You can see why the Steelers kind of coveted him with the wide zone system that they run. But he was also a really big asset, I felt like, in space. In multiple areas. He's a guy that could pull. Arthur Smith did lean into a little bit more gap or power concepts last year than he had in previous seasons with Atlanta, but also on screens, getting him out in space. He had a good radar for guys at the second, third level. And, that's an area that I think he's going to be able to help Pittsburgh's offense. You look at some of the numbers last year, they were one of the worst screen teams in the league last year. Didn't run a bunch of screens, but they were 25th in the NFL last season with 5.1 yards per attempt on screen passes. And then if you look at their numbers on rushing plays with pullers, they were 3.9 yards per attempt. That was also 25th in the league. So two of those strengths that I feel like we'll be able to carry over from Washington's offense. But, I think the big thing is obviously going to be pass protection. Switching Broderick Jones over to the left tackle position. We'll see how that ultimately unfolds. And if that, kind of helps get him back on track. We may talk about him in a future video, but I do feel like, his experience, he had a ton of pure drop back pass sets to where there's no play action. They're not moving the launch point, him mano a mano with an edge rusher. And I feel like that experience, coming out of college in a high octane passing offense is really going to help him as he acclimated himself to the pros. We'll see if that ultimately ends up being true. He loves the snatch trap move. I thought he was pretty good with his hands. And, he's one of those guys that has that trait of being able to get himself out of compromising positions. And I think that ultimately is what a lot of the great tackles in the league are able to do. A lot of these edge rushers are so skilled, they're so athletic, they're so explosive. You're going to find yourself where your technique's going to lose, where you take a misstep here or there, where you miss a punch, where, maybe your body gets turned or contorted in a particular way. But his ability to get himself out of those positions, I thought was really impressive. So I'm really excited about seeing him. I thought in college, some of the things I thought he needed to work on was, was a little bit susceptible to inside counters, could get, caught oversetting a little bit. And I thought just he could do a better job, sustaining blocks later in the rep and the run game, straining, things like that. But I'm still really bullish on the player. I hope he's able to stay healthy just so we can really see him hopefully reach his potential here in Pittsburgh. I really do believe in him, man. So my expectation for him, for 2025 and beyond is really that I hope that we're looking at him as a league average tackle. And, when the season concludes, I hope that that's the caliber of ball he's playing. And if that's kind of the trajectory, the player that we're looking at heading into 2026, I'm going to be really excited about having that guy blocking for what is hopefully going to be, a first-round quarterback prospect in next year's draft. So I think all things considered, I'd be really happy with that outcome. in a positive manner. I know there's going to be some bumps and bruises along the way, I'm sure, with this essentially being his rookie year. But I love the prospect, and there was nothing in the very short time that he played this past year that would sway me off of that, other than the fact that I just hope he's able to stay healthy with some of this injury stuff. So kind of moving on to the next player here, Zack Frasier. I mean, dude, I've almost like ran out of things to say about Zack Frasier at this point. Just going back and watching like a couple games from last year too, just the offensive line, and he was even better than I remembered. It's kind of been nice because I've been watching a lot of college film, been studying a lot of the 2026 draft eligible quarterbacks. So, got to watch a lot of like bad offensive line play, and it's nice to like not only just like get my eyes back on some like NFL film, which has been cool, but Frasier, you look at some of the numbers and they're ridiculous. He only allowed 9 pressures last season, 1 sack. Just so much to be impressed with. I thought the wrestling background, which we talked a lot about ad nauseum really throughout the draft process, really just translated immediately. His ability to win the leverage battle. He plays the great pad level. He sustains blocks with good hand placement. He's got the good grip strength. He can torque guys away and create rushing lanes. I think that, his ability to create displacement was also evident anytime they were asking him to work on like down blocks, things like that. But, just most of all, I really thought that he helped set the tone for the Steelers' offense and their offensive line in particular up front with his physicality, his finishing, just the way that he was playing through the whistle. And I thought that, along with Mason McCormack, who we'll talk about in this video, I just thought that Frasier was really one of the best finishers that I saw on film last season. I wrote an article about like my all-pro teams from last year. Frasier was on one of my 3 all-pro teams. And just because that wasn't, a Steelers bias. I mean, if you guys are subscribers to the channel, you guys know that that's not really how I get down anyway. But I do think that Frasier was just so good right away for the Steelers. I wish we would have seen him challenge a little bit more one-on-one and pass pro with some better competition. We didn't really get some of the premier matchups maybe that I wanted. Wish we could have seen him, face off against Dexter Lawrence. That would have really been like a marquee matchup, a good barometer of like just how special he could potentially be. But, we'll get those in the future, no doubt. There aren't really a ton of negatives to talk about, to be honest with you. I was even going back through some of my notes from like previous previews and recaps that I did. Shotgun snaps were a little bit of an issue early in the season, but that got better as the year went on. There was some blitz recognition stuff. I would say that was probably the biggest thing for me. They opposing teams did get them a little bit on some like 3-man twists, some exotic looks and things like that. Maybe some stuff that he wasn't as accustomed to seeing in college, through the A gap where he was a tad late or a tick late to recognize, come off the block and, seal those things off, where it led to some interior pressure on the quarterbacks. But I wouldn't necessarily say that was a huge red flag. It's just part of being like a rookie center and being able to be the guy really from day one that's snapping the football. So, I mean, he's not the athlete that like Creed Humphrey is. I mean, he's, maybe that's like its own small critique, but I mean, I'm not going to be very shocked if this guy, I will say, I will be shocked if he's not a perennial, top 5 center in the league. I think that's the level that he played at last season, bar none. I think those are the combos that he should be in. Just his ability to get off the ball and execute some of the reach blocks. I mean, I was going back and watching like the Washington game, for example, is one of their best games rushing the football, especially out of like 12 personnel, because Washington plays a lot of nickel. Some of the reach blocks he had in that game, like there's one in particular I'm thinking of where there's like a 2-eye 3 technique on the left side in the red zone, and like he reaches him so instantly and kind of contorts his body and moves the defender to the right and like creates this huge rushing lane for Jaylen Warren. And I'm really excited about what this is going to look like in year 2 now that obviously he's got a full year of experience, but he's got both of his guards coming back, and this offensive line, they've invested a lot in it, and I think he's going to be really the centerpiece for it. So when I did the Steelers, another exercise I like doing for Steelersnet.com is I write a piece about, ranking the top 10 Steelers on the roster. And I put Frasier at 3. And it seemed like a little bit that I may be getting ahead of my skis a little bit, just because I had him behind TJ Watt and Cam Hayward, and their best offensive player. But I don't know who else played better than he did last year. And I look at the guy who is still really young and at a position like that where they gave him so much responsibility to setting the pass protection, to making the mic calls in the run game. The moment just never seemed too big for him. And like, honestly, like I liked the player. Like I had an early 2nd round grade on him. He fell to 55 or wherever they picked him, 52. And that obviously selection looks great right now, but he even exceeded my expectations last year early on, and pretty bullish on what this could mean for a franchise that has pretty good lineage of pivot men throughout their history. So kind of moving on to the next guy. Unfortunately, this is another player who didn't really see a lot of playing time just because really a disastrous season for him. Unfortunately, the ankle injury, early hamstring pretty much ended Roman Wilson's season before it ever really began. I will say that like when he did return to practice later in the season, there were several credible beat writers. I know Alan Saunders from Steelers Now talked about how he looked much better and much more comfortable than he ever had up to that point. So that's a positive, even before he got hurt. So the way that I kind of viewed Roman coming out, and this is kind of going to be lead into more of like a broader discussion of like his usage and like projecting him into this offense moving forward and like the way that I think he should be used. But I kind of viewed him as a speed slot coming out. I thought he had like wide receiver 3 type of upside. I think that's the role that they had Calvin kind of playing last year. That's kind of the role I envisioned for Roman, using him to stretch the field vertically on deep shots, having him be the alert against single high, things like that. Using his speed to separate horizontally on those deep crossers, particularly play action, trying to push the ball to get those chunk plays. And then hopefully, once you hit a couple of those, his gravity is going to help make things easier for guys underneath him too, to create some space in that intermediate area of the field. And I think, if you're looking for ways to kind of differentiate him and Calvin as players, I think that Roman is obviously he's a little bit bigger, he's a little bit taller, a little bit thicker, but where he had the advantage, I thought, was in college. I thought he was really pretty solid in terms of finding the voids and zone coverage. I thought he was a little bit tougher in between the hashes. Catch the ball a little bit bigger on contact. Some of that does lead its way, not just to toughness, but just size in general, being able to absorb those hits from like safeties, linebackers, things like that up the seam. I just thought he was really tough in those situations. And, just the effort as a run blocker, that was something that was talked a lot about leading up to the draft process, that the no block, no rock type of mentality. And, I really appreciated, just his effort really throughout. When you watch Michigan's tape, they didn't throw the football a ton, but he was seemingly always showing like 110% on every rep. So, but, Calvin does have the advantage over him in a couple areas. I think he's a better route runner. I definitely think he's got more experience versus press coverage. It's not just like having been in the league for a couple years, but Calvin was a guy that played outside in like an X receiver role at Memphis, whereas like Roman's usage was a lot different at Michigan, where he was more of a flanker receiver, getting used in motion, stacks, things like that. And that kind of leads me to my point about like how I want to see him used. We've got a significant opportunity ahead of us right here, with the depth chart being what it is. Calvin's probably going to hold the pole position. He's going to get first dibs at wide receiver 2, probably trying to work his way into 12 personnel lineups and things like that. But, I'm a little bit worried for Roman that he may not be getting set up for success. And that's really just because like you look at some of the numbers, like one of the things I've complained about really since the hire was just that Arthur Smith, not a big like motion guy. They were 30th in motion last year on passing plays. I just looked at some of the numbers. I'm like, what were like the big plays that he was able to create as a schematic play caller that he was giving the guys an advantage? The leading receiver last year on receptions after they went into motion was Van Jefferson. He had 5 catches for 35 yards. That was like pretty much nothing. That would have ranked 71st among NFL wide receivers last year. The 35 yards was like 128th or whatever. So they just didn't do a very good job of like getting those guys free releases. And the free release part is really important in my opinion, because like Roman really wasn't developed that way at Michigan, just because that's not the way that he was used. They used a lot of what I would call like cheat or fast motion to get those free releases to take advantage of his speed. And, a guy that I kind of thought about, like, what do I want to see them do to try to utilize him best? It's like kind of what the Rams do. Sean McVay, he's kind of like the master of being able to use formations, use motion, stacks, bunches, things like that to get guys open. And you think about some of the receivers that they've had, Puka Nacua, Cooper Kupp, like with the tight splits and a lot of the things that they've been able to do with those guys that weren't like high draft picks. Even a guy like Tutu Atwell, which is probably like a decent comparison for a guy like Roman Wilson. Tutu last year, I think he had 24 catches, like almost 400 yards off motion. They've used all of these creative things to like motion him into bunches and, get him away from press coverage where he's not going to be overwhelmed with other guys like length or size. And I just, and it's not to say like he won't ever be able to do that. It's just, you don't want to throw him into a situation where he's having to learn on the fly like that and going up against those type of looks from day one, just because I don't think that that's setting him up for a ton of success. And the other question will be, is he big enough? Is he physical enough? Does he have the technique to go in and be like the 12 personnel guy where he's getting the tight splits? Because what you want is you want to try to take advantage of those premium looks, out of 12 personnel, you're going to get a lot of single high. You want to get those two-way goes where the lines kind of blur between, are you a slot receiver? Are you a boundary guy? You want to take advantage of that. And the best case scenario is that Roman is that guy next year, because at the end of the day, if it's another situation where they're having to try a guy like Robert Woods at his age out there to go by, be the blocker on early downs and things like that, it just kind of sucks because you kind of, put yourself in a situation where you're not really able to take advantage of the passing stuff because he's not going to have the juice to kind of take advantage of those one-on-one opportunities outside. So hopefully he can do those things. We'll see. Ultimately, I did want to bring up this quote. Nick Faribault, friend of the show, tweeted this today, but I thought it was really insightful. Wilson said he worked on route indicators, body level, his blocking technique, and maintaining his burst in and out of breaks. I think with everything I've said, there's some urgency to it. You got to get going. I'm ready for it. And I just thought that was really insightful. I always like hearing players talk about, them identifying their own weaknesses, working on those things, trying to bring that to the field. And ultimately, like, those are all things like the body indicator stuff, like not raising his pad level up before the break and being able to decelerate and maintain his momentum and regain momentum coming out of breaks. I thought that those were things that he really needed to work on coming out of college, where he had a really limited route tree. And, I'm so excited to see him when I get up to Latrobe later this year, just to see the progress that he's made. And hopefully he can carve out a nice role in the offense. So even if I think best case scenario is maybe he could be what Calvin was last year, which is probably a baseline, wide receiver 3, low end wide receiver 3. I think that would be a pretty good outcome. And with that being really his rookie year, de facto rookie year. But I know that's a lot on Roman, but kind of next part I want to talk about Peyton Wilson. So this is another guy that carved out a decent amount of playing time. We're expecting a bigger role for him in 2025 for sure. Just some of the stats I looked up for Peyton was, a 10% missed tackle rate. I thought for a rookie off-ball backer, that was really nice. 8.4 run stop rate, was 27th among 92 linebackers with at least 100 snaps last year. So there was definitely some production. He caused a couple turnovers, which was nice. But I just think it's worth reiterating this. When I'm evaluating players coming out of college, there's a couple positions where I don't want to say a hand wave away rookie seasons, but it's I almost expect them to be really bad, to be honest with you. Rookie quarterbacks, for example, are traditionally just very bad. But I think that we talk about them in that way a lot. We don't see, and of course, you're going to always have your outliers like Jay Daniels last year and things like that. But the other two positions that I think it's really difficult to translate from college to the pros is offensive tackle. Every offensive tackle is bad, from day one. And that's just the reality of it. You're really aiming for year 2, year 3 and beyond with those guys. And then off-ball linebacker, really just because the differences in the way that colleges play defense and the way the NFL plays defense with the hashes being different, all the different RPOs that you can take advantage of in college, just the rules being different. It's a totally different environment for those guys to operate in. And the fact that Wilson wasn't completely terrible or lost last year is a win in of itself. And I actually think that there were plenty of nice things to talk about with his game. And I thought that he was actually pretty decent, especially as the season wore on and he began to get more comfortable in this defense. So kind of talking through some of the things I really liked that kind of popped on film when I went back and watched it. Just thought he played really fast. It seemed simple, but he's a really good straight line athlete. I thought he trusted his eyes more and more as the season went on. He got more comfortable. A couple of reps that I wanted to point out, just the speed and overall range of his really pops. There's a rep early in the second Ravens game. I think it's the first drive of the game, actually, where Lamar's under center. They go to fake the ball to Derrick Henry. He pivots out to his left, and then they throw a screen to Zay Flowers in the flat, the opposite direction. He's able to run down the play from behind and keep it to a 3-yard gain. It's 2nd 7. But the play's blocked up perfectly. They have Benny Bishop doubled outside and those things. So it should have been probably a first down, and the fact that he had the athleticism to go track it down. And then, in man coverage, I thought that he held up really well out of the backfield. If you lined him up against backs, there wasn't a lot of times where I felt like he was really getting out leverage or guys were creating separation or beating him out to the flat. That was something they struggled with immensely, really over the prior 2 seasons, honestly, as the injuries started piling up. Just kept getting bit to the flat, didn't have the athletes to go out there and match up. But you saw Baltimore try to do that, take advantage of him, get a little pick play on him with Justice Hill running up the sideline on that wheel route. What I love about that play, he did get the interception, which was spectacular in its own right. But he wasn't in phase. He wasn't within arm's length of the receiver. He didn't look back for the ball prematurely. He kept fighting, kept trying to churn up ground and get himself back in position. Makes an awesome play. And to make a play like that in a rivalry game early on as a rookie, I thought that was really pretty awesome. Now, in terms of, two things I think will ultimately decide like his progression as a player, like where he's going to be able to get to moving forward. Most of the difficult coverage assignments really went to Patrick Queen. I don't necessarily expect that to change. That's why they paid him a good amount of money. But the zone coverage stuff, I think, is really an adventure for him right now. He gets like laser focused on what's in front of him. That's why I think the man coverage stuff kind of comes a little bit more naturally to him. Some of that's just like what he was asked to do as kind of like an overhang at NC State. But his feel for like what's behind him and what's going on around him is still pretty raw in terms of like taking receivers back, coming across the middle, things like that. There are some things that he's still lacking in that regard, but I think the coverage feel is one of the more difficult things for young off-ball linebackers to kind of grasp. And then the on-off splits, these can be really messy, especially like when you're looking at small sample sizes, like even a particular season as a whole. But they did give up 5.1 yards per carry with him on the field, as opposed to like 3.9 when he was off the field. Some of that's personnel, some of that's down at distance stuff with Landon Roberts kind of playing some early down stuff. But him and Queen, we talked about this as far as like the marriage between two players and that duo, operating in the same backfield. They're both kind of like run and hit backers. So his lack of length is going to prevent him from being like a prototypical stack and shed guy, even if they have him playing on the weak side to the formation. He's going to have to be a guy that's going to have to become an expert in terms of evading blockers in close quarters, getting downhill quickly. And I think you saw flashes of that for sure, but there are definitely other flashes where guys were able to get their hands on him and kind of, wipe him out of the play a little bit. But overall, I think that Wilson can really be a solid starter for this team moving forward. And the fact that they were able to get him in the third round, I think that selection looks pretty good right now. And I'm really optimistic to see what it looks like. I'm assuming that he's going to be the starter as we enter next year. They did bring in Malik Harrison. Perhaps he's carves a kind of a niche role into that Landon Roberts, previously held role, as well as helping on special teams. They do have Cole Holcomb. I'm not really sure what the game plan for him will be, but I think Wilson should be the de facto starter next to Queen because I think he earned that last season. And the more responsibility they put on his plate, I'm excited to see, how he, takes that responsibility and runs with it. But next person I want to talk about, Mason McCormack, 4th-round pick. So this is a guy who, like, we all thought was going to get a redshirt year, right? Like, he ended up starting 14 games because Isaac Seumalo missed a couple games early. James Daniels gets banged up. He's back in the lineup. So for a day 3 rookie coming out of the Missouri Valley Conference to come in and play like that right away, I thought that alone deserved positive recognition just because, like, he wasn't a complete black hole or anchor that, just completely derailed their success up front. The Steelers finished, I think, 29th in, like, yards before contact per rush, but I wouldn't necessarily say that was indicative of him or any of these guys individually. I think it was just more of like a group effort that they kind of struggled in that regard, as well as the scheme too didn't do them any favors at certain points. So I already kind of mentioned this, but I appreciate the physicality, the willingness to play through the whistle. He can be a real pest. Like he's got a little bit of a pest attitude to him. Like he's consistent, like pushing guys after the play. He can get underneath guys' skin, which I like. I thought on drive blocks or combos where he was working with Frasier in particular, you could really see his power show up where they were able to drive people and displace people off the ball. There was a rep that I retweeted earlier. I was going back and like trying to find some like clips from some games that I didn't go back and watch, but it was against the Raiders, and him and Frazier moved the nose tackle, I think like 7 yards off the ball or something crazy like that. So he's athletic enough to do the backside cutoffs as well. He's a pretty good straight line athlete. I thought in pass protection, a lot of his losses in pass pro weren't quick losses. The losses that couldn't be managed by the quarterback. And I thought that his anchor, for the most part, was pretty solid. When he was able to establish first contact off the ball, he was usually able to keep guys at bay for the most part. Now, I think the thing that really hurts him the most is just like, I just think he's really stiff. And it kind of shows up in a myriad of ways. First, he just plays so tall, like his pad level is a major issue. I talked about this ad nauseum, I feel like, over the course of the season, but he just has a tendency like to consistently stand straight up after the ball. He just sacrifices any leverage that he has and his power as well, because I do think he's got good play strength. It's just unfortunately like he's playing straight up sometimes and guys are able to get under his chest. And I thought when guys were able to get into his frame first, they were able to reset the line of scrimmage too consistently. And I was kind of looking for some stats. Like offensive line stats aren't like readily available really to the public, because they're just not really a ton of interest in them more than anything. But Sports Info Solutions has a stat that it's called like blown block percentage, and it's really just charts how often a blocker executed their assignment, on each individual play. And, he finished 67th out of 75 qualifying players in the run game department. I think that kind of matches the eye test, just because I do think he was better in pass protection than I anticipated. He does kind of struggle to change directions and mirror sometimes. I thought as the season went on, there was maybe some more issues in both regards than there were early on. And perhaps that's just more film, hitting a rookie wall. I think that that's certainly something to talk about as well. But, after thinking about it, originally when I thought about how I wanted them to attack the offseason, I was like, okay, like I would kind of like for them to add a guard, maybe to compete with McCormack, not necessarily saying that they need to replace him per se, but, as some competitions, starting quality guard that you could find on the market that's maybe got some experience. The more that the offseason kind of played out, I've kind of backed off of that stance, to be honest with you. And the reason for that is really just like I see the Steelers as a team in transition. Like, what's really the point in going out and getting a 29-year-old guard that might be a stopgap option when you can just let a little bit younger of a player kind of grow and develop and go through some of the growing pains kind of on the fly. And, next season you can attack this thing with a clearer head. You get a larger sample size to kind of evaluate him. Like I said, I don't think McCormack is like so bad that he's just not playable. I'm just not really ready to kind of point at him and say like, okay, this is definitely like the starter at right guard for the next however many years. And it's going to be, him and Frasier and Fotanu. And I'm just not really there with McCormack. And I know some people are. I want to see a little bit more improvement. And I really just think, he's not like a natural knee bender, but man, like if they can just get him to play with a little bit better pad level, because there are some flashes. I remember the Cowboys game in particular. There's some flashes where he does come off the ball and like he has good pad level, good hat placement. He's really able to drive people off the ball. He's got decent power and play strength. I really do believe that. So, he's also a guy that could get out in the screen game as well. So I'm really hoping that area of the offense improves next season. I hope they're able to come up with some more creative designs and, just get some cheap yards, some cheap production out of that, especially, knowing it's going to be Rodgers and he's going to want to get the ball quick out anyway. So, the only other player, unfortunately, his name escapes me right now, Ryan Watts. Ryan Watts retired, so that's not really like worth like talking about. Unfortunately, like he had, a pretty serious neck injury that he suffered early on in the process. So I definitely feel for him in that regard. The only other player that still remains on the roster from the draft class is Logan Lee. He didn't really play last year in the regular season, and then they played him like 30, 40 snaps in the preseason. To be honest with you, like I think if you go back and like watch my post-draft content from last year, which is still up on the channel if you're just like super curious, not that a lot of my thoughts on these guys have really changed, but my thoughts on Logan Lee, like pre-draft, I was just pretty underwhelmed by his tape. I just thought he was a little bit undersized. If I remember correctly in the preseason, they were almost like playing him like a little bit more at nose tackle at like 285 pounds. I don't really understand that at all. Could that just have been the depth at the time? Whatever. I don't really have a ton of thoughts on Logan Lee. When I did my 53-man roster projection, I actually left him off the roster in favor of Y.A. Black, who the Steelers took at the 5th round of this draft, just because I think that Y.A. has some 0-tech, some 3-tech versatility, and I just think that like with his length, he's going to be a more impactful run defender, and I just don't know that Lee has like the athleticism or that type of upside as a pass rusher to kind of offset that, even if that particular skill set might be more valuable. So ultimately, that's kind of the rundown of how I feel about the 2024 draft class, just where I think they are as players, where they need to go, their outlook on the team. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. Definitely let me know if you guys want me to do the 2023 draft, the Broderick Jones, Joey Porter, Keanu Benton class. Similar type of forum, I would be more than happy to go back and watch. I've already kind of like started going back and watching some film on those guys, just, planning for the future and things like that. So as always, I really appreciate your all's continued support to the channel, and I will holler at you guys next time. Peace and love.